Hello, I'm Laura Richcreek with Laura's Voice, and this is Laura Reads Foxed Books. Thanks for joining me. I am so glad you're here. This week we have 2 chapters to read, as both 5 and 6 are rather short. We meet a couple more members of the community and learn a bit more about our narrator. You'll have to share in the comments below what thoughts you have about him at this halfway point of the story. And so, without further ado, let's read The Old Gentleman of the Blackstock. Chapter 5. Of the Fragrance of Rosemary. During these years I had come to know many elderly people in the town besides the old lawyers and Mr. Miles, among them several old ladies. I have always had a fancy for old ladies. I was brought up in the house with a number of them, and as I am fonder of little girls than I am of boys, so old ladies appeal to me more than old men. They fill a place in life that would be quite bare without them. There is a certain something about them quite indescribable. They make much of the mellowness of life, and not a little of its fragrance. Some of them have a beauty with which the beauty of the most radiant belle can hardly compare. But it is not of this beautiful class only that I speak. Even when they are faded and worn, when all tints have vanished and all lines have subsided, with age which is content to acknowledge itself graciously as age, and does not pretend to be a belated adolescence, there is a charm all its own. There is a fragrance of rue and of rosemary, as well as of roses and violets, and thyme and lavender have their sweetness no less than heart's ease and lilies. There were more of these old ladies in my city than anywhere else I ever knew, and I had come quite naturally to know a number of them. They seemed to be found fittingly in the older and cheaper part of the town, where the ancient, once comfortable houses still lingered, though it was no longer fashionable or most convenient, and as my practice had not yet enabled me to emigrate to the desirable new quarter, I had, quite naturally, met a number of them. There are certain characteristics which are common to them all. They all dress in black. They all live in the past, and talk of your grandmother as if she were your aunt, completely forgetting your mother. And they all smile on the little children they pass in the street. I am rather fond of children myself, and have always followed a habit of making friends with those on my street, a practice from which I have at times found certain conveniences to follow. There are some inconveniences, of course, for instance in seasons of snow and also at other times, but they are inconsiderable. Occasionally, at these recurring seasons when tops come like winged ants on warm days in swarms out of the ground or from somewhere else, I had to submit to the ignominy of being stopped on the corners and compelled to display my inability to make a top do anything except flop around on its side like a headless chicken before a party of young ruffians, every one of whom could plug a top with diabolical accuracy, or could whip it high in the air and bring it down whirling like a buzzsaw. Or I would be held up on the sidewalk by a gang of curly-haired footpads and compelled, against my strongest protests, to jump a rope, held by 2 of a group of pestilent little creatures who would shout with laughter as they knocked my hat off in the dirt, threw sand into my eyes, and on my retreat pursued me down the street with jeers of derision. Or I would have to play a game of marbles while I lost, or stood the chance of losing, a client as well as the game. But on the whole, I think this had its compensations, and my acquaintance with the old ladies and the children in my quarter played an accidental part in my knowledge of the history of the old gentleman of the Blackstock. Oftener than once, indeed. As I was playing with the children, he came along and stopped to look at us. "Lucky dog," he said to me once as he passed. "I would rather be able to play marbles than to play monarch." And he went on his way rather slowly. Chapter 6. Basham Miles's History. But this was the way I came to hear of his history. I was calling one evening on an old lady, whom I knew as a friend of my mother's, and who had been good enough to call on me when I was sick once, and another old lady happened to come to see her whilst I was there. Her visit, as I recollect, was to tell her friend of some old schoolmate of theirs from whom she had lately had a letter, and who had sent Mrs. Gray a message in it. She had brought the letter with her, and the 2 friends read it and talked about the writer, who they both agreed must be older than either of them by several years, and about her family and history. And then they drifted back to their girlhood, when they all 3 had been together at the Springs one summer. It was 40-odd years before, yet they went over it all, recalled incidents, got them straight between them, discussed and enjoyed them again, down to the partners they had, the flowers they had been given by them, and the dresses they wore at the ball. All as if it had been yesterday. They had grown young again. In the course of their discussion, the name of Basham Miles occurred more than once. One of them declared that some incident occurred the summer Basham Miles was so attentive to Betsy Green. The other thought not, but that it was the summer after, and she tried to refresh her friend's memory by reminding her of 2 immense bouquets their friend Betsy Green had had, one of which they thought Basham Miles had given her, whilst they could not make out who had given the other. And then it had turned out that Basham Miles had given her neither, but had given his to Anita Robinson, whom he had just met, and whom he danced with that night. And one of Betsy's had been given her by an old gentleman from South Carolina, for whom she had sung, and Burton Dale had come back and given her the other. "And that was the beginning of his success," she said. The circumstance was remembered, but it failed to fix the year in my friend's memory. Then the other said, "Why, don't you remember, that night I had on a lilac mull, and you had on a white embroidered muslin?" "Oh, yes, to be sure." This fixed it. The girl's white muslin recalled it, with all its long attendant train of circumstances, after nearly 50 years of activity and change. My, how long ago that was, and yet it seems only yesterday," said my friend quietly, softly passing her thin hands over her black dress. Her eyes were no longer looking before her, but back at the past. I wondered, as I observed her, what she was thinking of in that 40-odd years, where lay embalmed and folded away so many things: love-making, marriage, wifehood, motherhood, widowhood, age, perhaps, for the thin hands still smoothed softly the old black dress, of the girl's embroidered muslin, and the young girl it held in its fresh folds that night. Her thoughts were not painful, whatever they were, for a pleasant and placid air rested on her face, and when she at length emerged from her reverie, it was with a gentle smile. Yes, it was a long time ago. Her friend, too, had been looking back into the past. "What a handsome man Basham Miles was then," she said reflectively. "I never thought so. There was always a self-consciousness about him which marred his looks to me," said my friend. "Oh, I think he was a perfect Adonis. I wonder if he has ever regretted not marrying. I think he was really in love with Betsy." "No, not he," said my friend. "He was too well satisfied with himself. I am very sure Betsy never thought he was in love with her. I wouldn't give Burton Dale, with his kind old heart, for 100 of him, with all his cleverness." The conversation had interested me, and I had sat still, putting off my departure, and feeling a certain interest in their talk and the train of reflections it had called up in me. Still, I did not put the parts together. I simply felt vaguely rather than saw anything which concerned me personally. I had certainly never thought of old Mr. Basham Miles as an Adonis, or as a careless and arrogant heartbreaker, and I followed the novel idea off into reverie and vacancy. I was recalled by the mention of the name Hill and Dale. The old lady who had worn the lilac mull, and who was much the haler of the two, was speaking softly, and I had lost a part of the conversation. "Yes," she said, "her health has been very poor ever since the birth of her last infant, and then her mother's death, just after Hill and Dale was sold, told greatly on her. So she does not get to see me as often as she did when she first came to live here, last spring." "I must go and see her," said my friend softly. "I will try and get there tomorrow." She looked away out of the window. "I would have been before, but I walk so badly now, I find myself putting things off. She brought her youngest sister to see me not very long ago. Very like Betsy. I could almost have thought it was Betsy herself as she sat by me and talked to me. You remember that way Betsy had of stroking your hand when she was sitting by you, talking earnestly?" "Elizabeth," "Yes, she is like Betsy, but not so pretty," said the other old lady, putting up her spectacles with elaborate care and rising to leave. "I thought she was rather prettier, but then I see so badly these days. Goodbye. You must come again. Don't wait for me to come. I don't walk much, and—" "Oh, pshaw, Malviny Gray. You have been trading on those 3 months of superior age to me ever since we went to school to old Mr. Persica when you were 12 years old, and I am not going to put up with it any longer. You are as arrogant about it as Basham Miles used to be about his intellect. Goodbye." And they kissed, laughing at their pleasantry and going over many new things and some old ones, and starting to take leave of each other, and began again over and over, as is the way with their sex of every age. I myself was leaving, so I handed the visitor down the steps and asked to see her home. But she positively declined this attention, declaring smilingly that I would think her as old and helpless as Malviny Gray. I, however, insisted, declaring guilefully that my way lay in the same direction with hers, though I had not the least notion where she lived, and she finally yielded, and I learned afterwards was much pleased at my attention. In fact, I have found that it is the small incidents, not the great ones, that make up life. As I went home, I saw Basham Miles turn in at his gate a little before me. His greatcoat collar was turned up, and he had a comforter around his neck, although the air seemed to me quite bracing, and as he slowly climbed his broad steps and let himself in at his old stained door, I thought he appeared more than usually feeble. End of chapters 5 and 6. This has been The Old Gentleman of the Blackstock by Thomas Nelson Page, illustrated by Howard Chandler Christie. Original copyright 1897. This edition, copyright 1901. Production copyright 2025 by Laura E. Richcreek. Thanks for being here. See you next week.